The greater of those horns of ancient flame began to tear and waver, murmuring as fires will do when struggling in a wind, drawing its pinnacle this way and that. As though this truly were a tongue that spoke, it flung its utterance out, declaring, "Once I'd set my course from Circe, she had kept me near Gaeta for a year or more before Aeneas, passing, named it that. No tenderness for son, no duty owed to aging fatherhood, no love that should have brought my wife Penelope delight, could overcome me in my long desire, burning to understand how this world works and know of human vices, worth, and valor. Out then, across the open depths I put to sea, a single prow, and with me all my friends, the little crew that had not yet abandoned me. I saw both shorelines. One ran on to Spain, the other to Morocco, Sardinia, and all those islands that our ocean bathes. I and my company were old and slow, and yet arriving at that narrow sound where Hercules had once set up his mark to warn that men should never pass beyond, I left Seville behind me on the right. To port already I had left Ceuta. "Brothers," I said, 100,000 perils you have passed and reached the Occident. For us so little time remains to keep the vigil of our living sense. Do not deny your will to win experience behind the sun of worlds where no man dwells. Hold clear in thought your seed and origin. You were not made to live as mindless brutes, but go in search of virtue and true knowledge. My men, attending to this little speech, I made so keen to take the onward way that even I could hardly have restrained them. Wheeling our stern against the morning sun, we made our oars our wings in crazy flight, then on and always leftward, making gain. Now every star around the alien pole I saw by night. Our own star sank so low it never rose above the ocean floor. 5 times the light that shines beneath the moon had flared anew, and 5 times too grown dim since we had set our course on that high venture. Ahead of us, a mountain now appeared, darkened through distance, soaring to my eyes higher by far than any ever seen. We cheered for joy. This quickly turned to tears. For now a wind was born from that new land. Twisting it struck at our forward timbers. The waves and keel 3 times it swirled around, and then a 4th. The afterdeck rose up. The prow went down, as pleased another's will, until once more the sea closed over us. Inferno, Canto 26. Welcome back to Professing Literature. We don't know where you are or when it is, but for us, it's Oklahoma City in the high summer of the year of grace 2022. Professing Literature is the podcast where we look closely at short passages of important works of literature in the hopes of seeing writers in action. We aim to work across literary genres and modes, comedy and tragedy, drama, poetry, fiction, looking at the dynamics of a passage in order to understand what the author is doing and what is at stake for the work as a whole, the issues that are clarified, the techniques that are involved. I am David Anderson, Associate Professor of Renaissance Literature at the University of Oklahoma, and with me today is producer Eric Williams. Good morning, Eric.
Hey, David. How's it going?
Not too bad, thank you. Beautiful summer day here in Oklahoma City, and it's nice to settle in and be back. We're talking today. Well, we're on episode 13, I believe, if you don't count the retrospective episode we've done. sort of sits between our two series. So we've had in the last little while the New Testament and Jane Eyre, and now we're sticking with the 19th century today and talking about Alfred Tennyson's poem Ulysses. So I'm right that this is a poem you know?
Yes, yeah. I had a book of Tennyson poems in, 11th grade that I carried around and read. I don't know why.
That's funny. Tennyson was the poet in high school that first captivated me, other than Shakespeare, who had started to get into my system a little while before that. Of all the poets, Tennyson was the one I started reading first. And to discover that you had the same kind of interest in him at the same time is terrific.
Yeah.
He's not exactly fashionable.
Yeah.
Even for people who want to read poetry, Keats or Milton or Yeats or someone, people like those have far more currency, I think, certainly among literary critics. So, yeah, the reason why both of us cottoned on to Tennyson at that point is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it's a destiny.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. For me, I always had this sort of strongly, I'm a romantic, I guess, and at that age especially, the sort of schmaltzy side of things had an appeal for me. And so The Lady of Shalott, Tennyson's beautiful early poem that really is wonderful, although that captivated me. And I just thought it was magnificent. And it is a great poem, but now it wouldn't be the first thing I'd reach for these days, but that one just rang my bell. But I went on from there, and I, as I mentioned, and probably do every episode, the Renaissance, the 16th and 17th centuries are my area of focus as a literary scholar, but it could have easily been Victorian poetry, Tennyson and Browning in particular. I always loved, so I'm glad to know that you did too. Did Ulysses stand out for you as a favorite, or?
I enjoyed all that I read. I think probably it was the Charge of the Light Brigade.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And I know that's what everybody probably would say, I guess. But I just remember like it vividly seeing, men charged to their deaths. Like he really does capture that.
Oh, it feels like you're riding a horse. While you're like the way that poem gallops forward, half a league, half a league, half a league onward. Yeah, that's a poem that sophisticated people, and I'm proud to say I'm not one, would roll their eyes at, because it's seen as just this kind of bellicose celebration of this, nationalist moment in British history, and yet it's just magnificent. It's so powerful. It's not a place where Tennyson is trying to think deep thoughts, but just convey an experience. Yeah, the sense of the men knowing that these orders that they've been given are bad and that this is going to turn out very badly, and yet they draw their sabers and they ride at this artillery battery. And I'm sold. Good choice.
For a long time at a place that I worked, I was there for about 11 years. I had that poem printed out and framed and hung right beside the door. A guy that I shared an office with was unfamiliar with it. And I was, because I made the reference, like there's not a reason why. There's blood to do and die. And he was fascinated by that. So I got that and printed it out. And that's kind of our mantra.
That's good. All right. I think that's excellent. There's a wonderful poem by Kipling, who I think is a tremendous poet that's, 20 years, 40 years maybe later than that poem, called The Last of the Light Brigade, that imagines the story. And it's a Tennyson's poem is a commentary on how these heroic everyday soldiers obey very foolish orders because of their grit and their courage and their will to duty. And how their leaders didn't deserve them. And Kipling's poem is an attack on a British nation which he thinks is not taking care of its veterans. And so he imagines the last of the Light Brigade, a small handful of old men who are impoverished and, amputees and things like that, who go and don't know what else to do. And so they go to Tennyson's house and they very politely request to talk to him and to tell him that, we're basically broken and you wrote about us and the kiddies at school, Kipling says, recite this poem. If you could please write another poem, sir, and let them know that we're starving. And so the poem ends with Tennyson. Kipling imagines Tennyson very generously being outraged and writing a poem that just excoriates the nation a second time, saying,
Yeah.
We call them heroes, and yet they're going hungry tonight. So
yeah.
Anyway, that's a worthy follow-up. But Alfred Lord Tennyson was one of the great figures of the Victorian literary era. He was born in 1809, lived a long life, and died honored. He'd been made a lord before his death. And in 1850, in middle age, he was made poet laureate, so the national poet. The record of poets laureate isn't always great in English literary history. There are some duds in there, and there are great figures like Wordsworth, who had done all their best writing long before they were made poet laureate and were mostly sort of tapped out by the time they were made the national poet. But I think Tennyson's output continued throughout his life. And I think you can debate what his strongest periods were. And I think most of those sophisticated people prefer his earlier phases. But I think the quality was at a pretty high level throughout his career. He'd been a brilliant young man from a large family in Lincolnshire in northeast England. Father was a clergyman. And Tennyson had many siblings. He came of age in the wake of the Romantic era in poetry. And the Romantic era is sometimes seen, and was seen at the time really, as this kind of flowering of genius that was only really equaled by the Renaissance, by the Shakespearean era, equaled or surpassed in English literary history. And so Tennyson had been under the spell of the Romantics and wanted to be a poet. He made his way to Cambridge, to Trinity College at Cambridge, where his genius was recognized and applauded, and committed himself to poetry and became celebrated for his poetry at a fairly early age. And then especially with the mid-career publication of In Memoriam, his long reflective poem on the death of his friend Arthur Hallam, he really became seen as England's leading poet, and shortly thereafter was made poet laureate on Wordsworth's death. So in his own lifetime, Tennyson was revered. By the time of his death, he had started to fall out of fashion. He himself was not a man, I think, who was particularly interested in fashion or was really all that bothered by what leading lights thought of him. But in the 20th century, his stock took a turn in the wrong direction, and he was written off often or overlooked, and it rebounded by the mid-20th century. And is sort of, he came to be seen once again as a great English poet. And he is. And he's a poet of diverse gifts who could do many different things. And today we're looking at one of his earlier poems, the dramatic monologue Ulysses, a poem Tennyson wrote in 1833, although it was only published probably about a decade after, I think, in his second collection of poems. So I call this poem a dramatic monologue, and I'll say a word or two about what that means. This is the second dramatic monologue. It's kind of a funny thing. It's the second dramatic monologue we've looked at on our show. The first was the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So the dramatic monologue is a form of poetry that the Victorian poets really invented, which is not to say there weren't earlier examples of this kind of thing, but really is a kind of proper, formal, poetic exercise Tennyson, and especially his great contemporary and peer and friend, Robert Browning, invented the dramatic monologue in a formal sense. So what do I mean by this? Well, the dramatic monologue is a poem that is spoken by a particular person. We are asked to imagine as a reader that someone very concrete is talking to us. And so it is a little bit like opening a volume of Shakespeare and taking out, say, Iago's soliloquy, or one of Iago's soliloquies in Othello, and just calling it a poem. So we've got an individual character who's talking to us, or sometimes the phrase that used is that we are allowed to overhear. In some cases, we have a character who's in conversation with someone else, and we hear one half of it, a little bit like if someone is talking on the phone in the next room and you can't help but overhear their half of the conversation, but you don't know what is being said to them. Sometimes it's less concrete than that, maybe more of a sense of someone musing a little bit the way proof rock does. We talked about how we don't really know the situation that we're being asked to imagine by Eliot in proof rock. It's sort of teased at us, but we might simply be hearing proof rock's thoughts as he thinks them, rather than having to understand that this is a really specific conversation. It's a strange conversation if it is a specific conversation. But we have this situation created and we have this character. In the case of Tennyson, right now we're talking about a mythological figure. So he reaches deep back, he reaches deep into the history of Western literature and takes one of the most important and famous characters in all of classical literature, Ulysses or Odysseus, as his speaker here. Sometimes it might be a character from more recent history. Think of Browning's Andrea del Sarto about the great Renaissance painter as an example. It could be a politician. It could be an everyday man in a very particular moment who's doing this talking, but who isn't necessarily famous. But anyway, the important thing about the dramatic monologue is that we have an utterance from a particular person. So a speech. The dramatic monologue allows you to really explore in a way that greatly interested these writers in the second half or latter 2/3 of the 19th century, a way to explore psychology, this sort of science that was coming into being on the kind of medical side of life in the Victorian world, had its fascinations for writers. Browning especially loves getting in the heads of weirdos, criminals, madmen, geniuses. And Tennyson, to a certain extent, did also. But we have this poem that's spoken by a particular person that's an invitation to really understand that person, or at least understand how the poet understands or imagines him. So with a dramatic monologue, we have someone talking to us. It's not like, the contrast we need to make is, say, a lyric poem by one of the Romantic poets like Shelley or Keats or Coleridge, or, I don't know, a poet like Yeats, who is in the generation or two after Tennyson, or an earlier poet like, I don't know, Robert Herrick or Edmund Spenser or something like that, where often in their lyric poetry, they are writing in a way that makes you you're invited either to think that the poet is talking to me. He hasn't created a character, a mouthpiece. He's talking to me and giving me his thoughts. Or else the poet is sort of speaking in what we could call the lyric voice, the disembodied universalizing voice. So in Keats's odes, we don't have a sense of a particular character talking about nightingales or Grecian urns or melancholy. Rather, we have this sort of universalizing voice. And so much poetry is that way. But with dramatic monologues, we're in the concrete character's hands. And so we're being asked to think about this particular person, just the way we do when an actor performs a Shakespearean soliloquy on stage. So interesting questions come up then, because it's not just what does the character tell us, but it's what does the character tell us that he doesn't mean to tell us. We're really invited to get in between the lines with a dramatic monologue as we eavesdrop on a conversation. So that's a little bit about the dramatic monologue. I hope it was enough to be useful and not too much so that it's just boring. But I said all that just to sort of set the table so that we understand what Shakespeare is doing in this poem, or Tennyson is doing, what Tennyson is doing in this poem, Ulysses. So Ulysses is the Latinized name of Odysseus. And Odysseus is about as important a character as you can find in world literature. Odysseus was one of the great captains of the Greek armies, the host that sailed to sack Troy in the Trojan War. So for 10 years, the Greeks were encamped around the walls of Troy trying to conquer the city. Odysseus was one of the most important figures in that long saga. So if you read the Iliad, you know that Odysseus is very prominent in the Iliad. Eventually, of course, he's the man who breaks Troy, because Odysseus is the man who comes up with the great legendary gambit of the Trojan horse as a way to lull the Trojans into complacency and allow the Greeks to smuggle themselves into the city so that they can destroy it. So 10 long years of war for Odysseus are then followed by 10 years of wandering and languishing as he attempts to get home again. Odysseus is from Ithaca, which I don't think we're quite sure where his Ithaca was supposed to be, but there's a modern-day Greek island named Ithaca on the west coast of the Balkan Peninsula. And so Odysseus has to get roughly somewhere like that, and he can't do it. For 10 years, he's waylaid, he's cursed. The god Poseidon has it in for him and attempts to prevent him from reaching home. He's waylaid by various beautiful goddesses and witches who want him to become their sort of lover. But he wants to get home. He wants to get back to his wife, Penelope, who's faithfully waiting for him. And he wants to get back among his own people. And so his story is the story, to use a Greek word, of the nostos, the homecoming. Because in the Odyssey, of course, he does eventually, after innumerable adventures, he does come home again. And when he comes home, he does what the king should do when the king comes home, which is put things to rights. His kingdom had been overtaken by a gang of horrible suitors who had not gone off to the Trojan War and who want all of them to marry Penelope so that they can be de facto king of Ithaca. Penelope resists their advances for years. The pressure is mounting, but Odysseus, with the help of the goddess Athena, finally comes home, destroys the suitors in a vicious bloodbath that's quite fun to read about, and has reunions with Penelope, with his son Telemachus, and with his father Laertes, his aged father Laertes. So it's a very moving story. It's a heroic story. It's full of great moments of courage and great moments of grief and poignancy. But it's the story of the man who wants to return to his place and to his life. Odysseus passes up the opportunity to live eternally with the goddess Calypso on her beautiful Mediterranean island as her lover. She can give him immortality if he will stay with her. And so for whatever it is, 7 years, I think, he's on Calypso's isle. She won't let him go until the gods say, you got to let him go. But every day on Calypso's isle, Odysseus weeps because he longs to return home and wants not immortality, but to be a man, to be a human. And eventually he finds his way home again. And so this is the story that Tennyson is handling. He gives us an Odysseus, or a Ulysses, as he is called, coming out of the Latin tradition, a Ulysses who has returned home, has been home for several years, and is thinking about who he is and what to do. In the Odyssey, I think it's book 11 of the Odyssey, when Odysseus is in the underworld, he is given a prophecy. It's rather brief, but there's a prophecy that's given to him that he will return home, but that after he goes home, he will set out on another voyage and that he will die at sea. He's not told any more than that, but we're given that much. And so Tennyson is imagining the moment between those two journeys. After Odysseus has come home and has been ruling his kingdom of Ithaca, this tiny little island, for a while, and before he sets out on this last prophesied journey. Tennyson is also drawing on Dante. We began the episode with Dante and his conversation with Ulysses in the 8th circle of hell in Inferno, and we will look back at that again before we conclude, but I won't say much about that for now. We'll just take a look at the poem. So I'll read this poem, which is it's not that long. It's a lot shorter than Proof Rock, and it's a lot shorter than those passages from Jane Eyre that I was throwing at you last time. So it shouldn't take me very long. Here we go, Ulysses. It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth, among these barren craigs, matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone on shore, and when through scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vex the dim sea. I am become a name, for always roaming with a hungry heart. Much have I seen and known, cities of men, and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least but honoured of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untravelled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life, life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains, but every hour is saved from that eternal silence, something more, a bringer of new things. And vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this grey spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star, beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the sceptre and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labour by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centred in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He works his works, I mine. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine, and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. Old age hath yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'Tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles, whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Well, it's a remarkable poem, and there's much that could be said about it. Just to read it aloud is a powerful experience. I'm sure you noticed the way it builds and builds and builds in intensity as it moves forward. It starts in quite a reflective place where the speaker of the poem, Ulysses, is meditating, and it ends with a sense of rousing exhortation. We don't know. There is more concreteness here in this poem than there is with the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. There is less than there is in some other dramatic monologues. It's not exactly clear if we're listening to Odysseus's thoughts or to his spoken words. In my sense of things, it's some of both. I could be wrong. As I read this poem, it feels to me as though we begin in Ulysses' thoughts as he considers his situation, looks around, and reflects on the disjunction he feels between his present experience and his heroic past. He then considers his son. He says, "This my son, mine own Telemachus," which maybe suggests that he's looking at Telemachus, thinking about him. But then we end in the last third of the poem with a sense of a spoken exhortation. And we don't need to imagine that that's absolutely correct, that it's the only way to read the poem. We could still be in Ulysses' thoughts. But we do have the implication that either he's speaking to his men or at least he's imagining speaking to them. Because now there's a sense of a more direct address rather than a meditation and an exhortation to do something. He's speaking to them to encourage them to join him in a return to the seas. And he does so persuasively. Ulysses is a great hero. He's a great warrior. But what makes him stand out from the other captains of the Trojan War, Ajax and Achilles and Diomedes and Agamemnon and the others, is his tongue. Odysseus is able to speak, to use words as weapons for sometimes good purposes and sometimes maybe not so good purposes. He is, Homer says in the first line of the Odyssey, Homer describes Odysseus with the word polutropos, which can be translated various ways. Sometimes you see it translated as cunning, and cunning is an idea that's always attached to him, whether it's in the Homeric poems or whether it's in later Greek literature, such as Attic tragedy, or whether it's in Virgil's Latin Aeneid. Odysseus is the man of cunning. And cunning is a valuable attribute. It's also an attribute that's got, raises some ethical questions. But Odysseus, we see over and over again, uses his brains to extricate himself, to win in ways that are remarkable. If you know the incident of the Cyclops cave, when he figures out how to get he and his surviving troops out of the cave of this horrible man-eating giant. You know what I'm talking about. The Trojan horse, where he finally thinks of a way that the Greeks can get into the city by fooling the Trojans. Odysseus is the man of cunning. It's Polytropos has been translated other ways. I can't remember who it was, but the man of many turnings. In other words, someone who has moves and maneuverability. This is who he is. And we see him now at a point in his life where there seem to be no more turnings or no more use for his cunning. And we seem to see him longing for those old days. And maybe at the end of the poem, if he is indeed speaking to his men, he's using that ability with language and perhaps that cunning to bring them once again to the point where they can capture the spirit of the old days. Anyway, let's work through the poem. So how do we understand this poem? It's a poem about the nature of heroism. The traditional view of the poem, the view that was near universal in the 19th century, and that still is one important approach to the poem today, is that it is a kind of unironic view of heroism, and that Ulysses is to be admired because he represents the kind of undying human will to move forward despite his decline. And so we admire Ulysses because, in spite of the fact that he's now an old gray man, as he says, he still has this relentless desire for more life, for more experience, as he puts it, and has this unconquerable will. His body is being slowly conquered by age, but his will remains what it always has been. And so we cannot help from that perspective but admire this man. It's more complicated than that, though. And in the 20th century, ironic readings of Ulysses began to emerge. Readings that looked critically at this character and probed the poem for moments of selfishness and saw him in a less than flattering light. And there are reasons why those critics landed there. We'll talk about them in turn. And then there's also the legacy of Dante, whom Tennyson was grappling with, because Dante's portrayal of Ulysses, we heard Dante's Ulysses speak at the beginning of the episode. His portrayal of Ulysses is not flattering, or at least it flatters him very moderately, but it also puts him in hell, where he's suffering for his life of sin and for his misuse of language during his lifetime. So where am I going to wind up? Well, we'll see, but I'm going to be somewhere in the middle, I think. I think it's impossible not to see this poem in heroic terms. Certainly Tennyson, from what I understand, never gave any suggestion in his own later writings when this poem was mentioned that he understood the character ironically. But at the same time, if full-blown irony seems excessive to me, we nevertheless have a sense, I think, of, how do I want to put it, of the cost of what it means to be Ulysses. And so the portrait of heroism is genuine, but not necessarily fully celebratory. Anyway, I'll see if I can convince you of this as we go on. We begin with a character who describes himself as an idle king. There are probably a lot of people in the world who could think of worse things than to be an idle king. King at a time of crisis is one thing, but an idle king who gets to enjoy the perks of kingship apparently doesn't have to do very much, or at least very much by a certain standard, might not seem so bad. But of course, Ulysses is the one who refused the offer of immortal delight with Calypso because he had to keep going He had to go home. And so to be an idle king, if you're Ulysses, is less than ideal. He's an idle king, and he's sitting by this still hearth among these barren crags. So in just a single line of blank verse, we have vivid impressions of how Ulysses regards the life that awaited to him on the rocky isle of Ithaca, where he returned. The hearth is still. It's not crackling merrily with bright flames, and the crags are barren. So these are emotionally loaded descriptors that give a sense of stagnation and lifelessness as he looks around him. A rock-bound coast can be a beautiful thing, but he sees it as barren. The quiet hearth isn't necessarily a terrible thing, but by describing it as still, he's suggesting a lack of animation. And then things get even stronger. He says that he's matched with an aged wife. If there's one line in the poem that is going to bother people and that is going to invite the reading that challenges the idea of Ulysses as a speaker that we are supposed to admire, it's going to be this one. Penelope in the Odyssey is heroic in a way that is a powerful and poignant counterpart to Odysseus's heroism. His is the heroism of the open sea, of battling monsters, of going down to the underworld. Hers is the heroism of patience and wisdom and a refusal to break faith with her husband. She has not yet heard conclusively that her husband is dead, even though 10 years of war and then 10 years of wandering have passed. And so she will not accept one of the other suitors. And the suitors are bringing very hard and nasty pressure to her, demanding that she accept one of them. And she fools them. She says that she can't do that until she finishes weaving her tapestry. And of course, every night she unpicks her tapestry so that I think her name even means the weaver. And so she doesn't make any progress on her tapestry, and this bothers the suitors, and the pressure is mounting, but she's holding out a hope that her husband, the man she loves, will return. And Homer gives us the sense that Penelope's domestic heroism is genuine heroism. And now we have Ulysses looking at her and not even giving her name. He will name his son, but he doesn't name her. He simply thinks of her as an aged wife. Now, he says he's matched with her, so he knows that he, too, is aged. He's not pretending that he's evergreen. But this is where he is. The man who had been loved by Circe and Calypso is now sitting beside his aged wife, and he says, I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race. The Ithacans are a rough and primitive people. We get a strong sense of this in the Odyssey, that Odysseus visits cities and points of civilization. Indeed, he's destroyed in the Trojan Wars, one of the great centers of civilization in his world. But Ithaca, his kingdom, is a rustic little backwater. And here he's looking at his people as savages, almost as though they don't deserve him. And he says, what do? They hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. So they're almost animals in his description. And they don't understand him. They do not know me. And from one point of view, this is perfectly comprehensible. He is different. He has 20 years of difference that's shaped him. And so we can understand the idea that he does not fit here anymore. But it is fair to say that his language sometimes puts things in a way that makes it sound denigrating. He goes on, though, and he unfolds his own character. And perhaps we come to understand, or we begin to understand, that although the language might give us a bit of a sour taste in our mouths, it is natural for the man who has been shaped the way he has been shaped. And so he says, I cannot rest from travel. He can't stand still. Stillness to him, the still hearth, is death. For another person, it could be life. It could mean peace. It could mean being rooted in the place where you are supposed to be rooted. But for him, it seems to mean death. And so he says this potent line, I will drink life to the lees. The lees is the sediment in the bottom of a wine bottle or a wine barrel. And so to drink life to the lees means to drink the whole thing right down to the bottom, even to the less than palatable part of the wine. He's going to gulp it down. And so he's offering us a contrast between the zest he still wants out of life and his situation now. And he goes on and talks about how he has both enjoyed greatly and suffered greatly throughout his life, whether with others or alone, whether on shore or on the deck of the ship. He has always embraced life. And life is really, one of the great themes of Homer's poem, that Odysseus is a figure of life. Odysseus is someone who wants to live. And the power of the poem is that it is a celebration of life. Odysseus has to go down to the underworld, and in the underworld he meets Achilles, who had made who had been offered the choice between a long, boring, unacclaimed life or the short life that would be famous forever throughout the world. And of course, Achilles chose the short life and undying glory. And he confronts Odysseus in the underworld, and they speak. And he tells Odysseus that it would be better to be born the meanest slave on earth than to be the king of all the hosts of the dead. So live while you can. And Odysseus is someone who will live. And life for him means not safety, it means risk and movement. And so he's a character of great dynamism. And now that is being stifled. He tells us that he has become a name. I am become a name for always roaming with a hungry heart. So we have this sense, this highly romantic sense of the explorer, of the intrepid one, of the one who must go forward, and a sense that for Ulysses, he has become the legend. He has become his own legendary identity, that his identity is in the doing. And so his hunger is not for home, his hunger is for movement. And so on he will go. He talks about what he has seen. Cities, manners, climates, councils, government, and how he has found honor there in the wider world. His illiterate people don't understand. They've never left this island. They can hardly believe it when he would tell them of how he was once a key voice in the councils of the Greeks before the walls of Troy, about how he's honored by the Phaeacians when he washes up on their island in the Odyssey and they discover who he is. He tells them in this great scene, I think at the beginning of book 8 or 9, that I am Odysseus, and they're shocked. He's been honored wherever he's gone, and he has lived. Drunk delight of battle with my peers far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. He has lived life at an extreme, but here he is not known. He goes on and says that he's a part of all, I am a part of all that I have met, which is a lovely way of describing the way in which experience shapes character and is almost absorbed into character. And so our characters are not cut glass. They're not something that is shaped initially at our birth and remains fixed. They are something that grows or perhaps diminishes, but at least changes with experience. And you can't separate a person from their experiences. They will not be the same person. That's not the same thing as saying we're simply equivalent to our experiences, or that there is no, I'm not someone who would say that there is not still the core self there as the thing that receives the impressions of experience. But we are shaped by what we go through. And so we're beginning to have a sense of Ulysses as someone who is a certain way because he could not be otherwise because of what he's gone through. That he has this longing to set forth again and this restlessness at home, not simply because he finds Ithaca boring and because he no longer finds Penelope attractive, although there might be elements of truth in both of those, but because he is a certain way. And so he says, I am a part of all that I have met. My experience has changed me, has formed me, has made me this way. And he goes on and says in a complex cluster of lines that all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. These are not easy lines, but they're very, very powerful lines, and I think they're quite brilliant. All experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world. What I have gone through is a kind of passage that gives me a vista of something new opening up before me. And so I see the world opening up ahead of me, and the margin, the horizon fades. And of course, this is what happens when we move forward. We're walking towards a horizon that continues to call us. You know, we don't come to the edge of the world and look over a sheer cliff. We always have more world ahead of us, more experience ahead of us. And when we move, the horizon, the margin moves too. And so that calls us to more movement. And Ulysses has to move. He says how dull it is to pause to make an end. And again, a different person would see this differently. A different person would say, finally, here's where I am. Here's where I am meant to be. Here is where I will call home. But Ulysses understands this with yet more figurative language, or more emotive, descriptive language. He sees it another way. He says that it means to rust unburnished, not to shine in use. So to be still is to be stagnant from his point of view, as though to breathe were life, as though it were simply enough to call yourself alive because you're breathing. Little remains, he says. He's an old man, and he knows that his time is nearly up. But what he wants to do is save every hour from that eternal silence. We have a more or less pagan conception of death, which is quite fitting. He expects nothing in the afterworld, and whatever meaning there is to be gained has to be gained in this finite amount of time that he has left to him. And he's not going to be happy with simply what he calls life piled on life. He might have a longer life if he remains on Ithaca, secure, but it's not going to be life. To breathe is not simply to live, according to him. He has to keep going. And so it would be vile, he says, for another 3 years, 3 sons, to store and hoard myself. He's already used that word hoard once when he described his people, his Ithacan subjects, who hoard, like squirrels with nuts, animalistic, simply gathering up and holding on. To store and hoard myself would be a failure. It would be vile. Because although his spirit is gray, he says it's yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. Ulysses is offering us a picture of endeavor that that so many find so attractive, right? It's the spirit capturing, it's capturing the spirit of adventure and exploration, which was so compelling in the 19th century, where people set out to find the sources of the Nile or the North Pole, to map the world. It's, the sort of spirit of adventure you see even in something like Star Trek. The idea of going onward, of discovering, of having to find what is out there, to follow knowledge like a sinking star. Again, that idea of going over the horizon, beyond the utmost bound of human thought. One word we can use to describe what we see here is the word Promethean. Prometheus, many of you will know, is another great figure from Greek mythology. He's a Titan. So one of those creatures whom the gods overthrew, the Olympian gods, following Zeus, overthrew the Titans. Prometheus was allowed to continue by Zeus, but he broke the law of Zeus when he violated Zeus's command and stole fire from the gods. Fire had been a secret kept by the gods. And Prometheus gave fire to human beings because he knew that in doing so, they would have protection and they would be able to advance, that fire was at the heart of the human being's ability to conquer nature, to make things, and to live an existence that was more than that of the animal. And so Prometheus violated the law of Zeus and was punished for it when it was discovered that he had given fire to human beings. As a symbol, Prometheus was fascinating to writers in the 19th century. Percy Shelley, the Romantic poet, wrote a tragedy, Prometheus Unbound, a very strange work that celebrates Prometheus as the noble violator of tyrannical authority. His wife, Mary Shelley, in a work that is more celebrated and even more interesting, Frankenstein, a book that many of you will know and that we should talk about on this podcast before too long, offers a sort of Promethean warning story. Frankenstein's subtitle, if I'm remembering rightly, it's either the subtitle or it was the original title that was changed. But I think the proper title of the book is Frankenstein: the Modern Prometheus, because Dr. Frankenstein violates convention and morality and norms in creating his monster, and then pays the price for it, pays a terrible price for it. And so Prometheus is a rule breaker, but he's a rule breaker that a writer like Percy Shelley certainly sees as admirable, that the laws he's breaking, that he's a revolutionary figure who transgresses and goes further than he's supposed to and does things that the king or tyrant of the universe, Zeus, forbids, but that are noble and right and true-hearted. And so the idea of the boundary violator, who is to be viewed sympathetically, is a powerful one in this era. And we have something of that with Tennyson's Ulysses. Prometheus is the spirit that compels human beings to split the atom, to sequence the genome, to launch into orbit, to discover new countries and new lands. And so there's something, especially for modern people, that's utterly attractive about that spirit, even though there's perhaps also something troubling about it too, that we can acknowledge. Dante, as we will see, does not have a positive view of the Promethean mentality. But with Ulysses, we have a Promethean figure, and he seems to be presented attractively. He wants to go forward, even though convention and morality would tell him, you are king, you have duties and obligations. It is perhaps Natural, then, that at this moment he reflects on his son. This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter and the isle. So in other words, it's not a total abnegation. Even if I'm abdicating my duty, I'm not doing so in a way that will harm my people, because I have a son and heir who will carry on after me. And he goes on to explain that he loves Telemachus and that Telemachus is right for the job, that Telemachus is the sort of person who can, by slow prudence, do what he needs to do for the Ithacan people. And the Ithacan people, again, Ulysses says, need to become civilized. They need to become mild, he says. They are a rugged people, and Telemachus can subdue them to the useful and the good. He can be counted on to do what is necessary. Ulysses has to do the extravagant and perhaps, from an objective point of view, unnecessary thing of going on, of traveling he knows not where, but simply into the West. Telemachus, he says, is fit for what he calls he's centered in the sphere of common duties. And common duties are not what Odysseus, the rule breaker, was known for. The Polytropos, the man of many turnings, is not well suited for common duties, for the things which are honorable but unglamorous. And so he says of his son, he works his works, I mine. And there's maybe, you could infer a little bit of envy, I don't know, perhaps in that remark about the two of them, he works his works, I mine, that the idea that someone could be satisfied, as Telemachus seems that he will be by this life, is perhaps to be envied from the perspective of the traveling man, the rolling stone who can't gather any moss. Or you could see it perhaps as sort of subtly contemptuous, that a man could be satisfied with that. I'm not sure Tennyson is giving us much scope for either of those emotional reflections, though. But what we do have is a sense, again, that Ulysses has a nature, and that nature brings with it a calling. And so he is one way and can't live a different way. Now, that's the kind of excuse people make when they want to do something in spite of other people. That's the kind of excuse that a man might offer when he's leaving his faithful wife of years, that I got to be me. This is just who I am. But it is the sort of thing that Ulysses is saying. I am a certain way. I am called to a certain thing. I can't rust unburnished here. This brings us to the last third of the poem. And as I said, we have the sense that Ulysses is now speaking to his men, his sailors, or at least is imagining how he would speak to them when he calls them together. And so we're in a less reflective phase of the poem here, a more assertive one, a more rhetorically sharp-edged one, as he's not just mulling his situation, he is now trying to move people to follow him. And nobody does it better in literary history, compelling people to join him than this character does. This is what he is famous for. And so he says, there lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail. So there's the sense, again, whether in reality, like whether he's actually been making decisions and issuing orders, whether in reality or whether just in his imagination, we have a ship ready to set out to sea in the evening. And you have this wonderful Homeric phrasing, there gloom the dark, broad seas. I love that use of the word gloom as a verb. There gloom the dark, broad seas. This thing that is almost sinister, but for him so enticing, so appealing to set out again. And so he now refers to his mariners, my mariners that have been with me. And this is a strange little wrinkle in Tennyson's poem that he inherited from Dante, because if you know the Odyssey, you know that of the ships that set out from Troy, a number of them, I can't remember the number, but a number of them were Ulysses' ships with his men carrying their booty from the sack of Troy. They set out to go home again. But over the course of their adventures, he loses ships and he loses crew to monsters and to accidents. And finally, all of his crew are destroyed because they bring upon themselves divine wrath when they eat the cattle of the sun god. Odysseus is the only one who doesn't eat the sacred cattle, and so he's spared. So he's the only survivor. He's the only one who comes back to Ithaca, the king alone. Dante and Tennyson both give us the sense that Ulysses still has living companions who've been with him throughout. So that's okay, but it is something that should be noted in case you find it jarring if you only know his story from Homer. He gives us here, and again, perhaps this is partly because his rhetorical situation where he's trying to convince people to join him means that he has to stress it this way, but he gives this very winsome and moving depiction of companionship and comradeship, that we have been through so much together and that we always faced it with a smile, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine, that we said yes to whatever life gave us, even when it was hard, and that we opposed free hearts, free foreheads. So we have this sense of companionship and this idea that we have always been ourselves and we always willed to say yes, that we were free. I don't know, it's an unquestionably attractive picture that he's giving of these men who, along with him, embraced this sense of adventure. I'm not sure how trustworthy it is. Given what he's said, Ulysses is someone who you could say is more compelled than free. If you're simply doing what you do because you have to do it because it's your nature to do it, then how free are you? Maybe you are free. But this is the way we were, he says, and now we're old. But old age hath yet his honor and his toil. There is still meaning in old age. Something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. That, of course, is Homer, where gods both help and hinder the heroes of the Trojan War. And Odysseus in particular is attacked, hated by Poseidon, who tries to prevent his homecoming and tries to destroy him, and he is helped by Athena, his sort of patron goddess, who aids him. But they had striven with gods. And so there's still something, even though those days might be past, we are still those people. And there's something of nobility, not of practicality or of functionality, but of nobility that could be done. What is that? You know, from a certain perspective, the great explorer, the great adventurer is doing something that has no utility. He might come up with a discovery that will pay off years in the future, but there's something gratuitous about what he's doing. You know, what did it really do for America that it landed a dozen or so men on the moon over the course of several years in the late 60s and early 70s? Did that really do anything practical to justify the cost of it? Well, maybe not, depending on who you ask, but maybe yes. What it did, if it is to be validated, it would have to do with nobility. It would have to do with symbolism, not with the fact that moon rocks can fetch a big price on the open market. If those expeditions to the moon had meaning, it was a meaning that was in their nobility, about the statement they made about America. And so some work of noble note may yet be done. We don't quite know what that is, but it will have to do with setting forth. And so they are called. The light begins to twinkle from the rocks. Ulysses is calling his men because he is saying we are being called. We're being called by the fact that this is the end of the day. There's no accident that Tennyson has them setting out on this journey in the evening rather than in the morning, because they are in the evening time. May seem like an odd time to get on this fairly primitive single-sailed oared vessel and go off into the west, but it's fitting. The west, where the sun goes down, is where they're sailing, and that's fitting because they are westerly in their own lives. They are old. Their suns are going down. And it's the evening time now, as it's the evening time for them, but it's still worth setting out. And so you have this sort of haunting description of the end of the day by the coast. The long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Tennyson is the most sonorous and resonant of poets. He has this exceptional ear, and he can just give us the feeling of this void of the ocean calling, saying, come, come. And we're sort of captivated as we read. And so Ulysses says, come, my friend, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world, which is gorgeous, heroic language. Is there a new world for them to find is another question. Dante will say it's out there, but they'll never get there. They can't get there. But the seeking of the newer world is what seems to matter here. It's not, he doesn't say it's not too late to find another world, but to seek a newer world. And so push off, and off we will go. We don't know if they are actually moving now or if he's still just exhorting them. But he says, we will smite the sounding furrows. So he's describing his oarsmen rowing, but he doesn't just say we will row through the water, which would be, an accurate, if unpoetic thing to say. Instead, he says we will smite the sounding furrows. So there's a sense of the oars doing violence to the waves as they cut through them. Rather than just saying row, he's expressing the sense that we will confront and overcome each wave, which of course is what a ship has to do as it cuts through the waves that it encounters and surmounts them and passes them by. Each one of those is a little image of human intrepidness moving forward through those waves and of victory over them. We're going to go into the farthest west, sailing, he says, beyond the sunset. So he clearly does not have a sense of a round world, at least as Tennyson imagines him. He's imagining going beyond where the sun sets and where the western stars go down into the ocean. And we don't know what we will get. He's not disputing the fact that this endeavor may not end successfully. He says it may be that the gulfs will wash us down. And of course, that's the prophecy of Tiresias in the Odyssey, that you will die at sea. And it's also what happens in Dante. And so he admits this possibility. It might be that the gulfs will wash us down, or it might be that we will touch the happy isles, that we will find Elysium and see the great Achilles whom we knew. That's a lovely line, the idea that Achilles' great spirit might be out there in Elysium, and we knew him, and we could see him again. It forgets the fact, as I've already mentioned, that in the Odyssey, Odysseus does find Achilles again, and he's not in the happy isles of Elysium. He's in Hades, in the underworld, where he's not being punished, but he's just suffering the eternal existence that the early Greeks imagined for the human soul, which was one of sort of privation and bare consciousness. And as I said, Achilles was saying any life on earth would be better than to be the king of all the dead, because we do nothing but long for the life that we used to have, for the blood that used to pulse through our veins. But maybe we will see the great Achilles whom we knew. This is a moment where you could say Odysseus is being dishonest here because he's already met Achilles, although that might be overdoing it a little. Though much is taken, much abides. So we are less than we were, but what we are is still considerable. He says, we are not now that strength which we used to be in old days, which could move earth and heaven. But we have one equal temper of heroic hearts. Notice how he's imagining solidarity between himself and the crew. So someone who's reading the poem ironically could say, tisk, tisk, tisk. He is duping these poor men into drowning and leaving their families. And he's doing so by saying, we're all in this together and we're all cut from the same cloth. Well, again, if that kind of reading is your preference, fair enough. Although I think it might be going overboard. But then this is Ulysses. This is the man of many turnings. He says, we're made weak by time and fate, but strong in will. And then you have this potent, magnificent last line, which is this series of verbs in the infinitive: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. I was speaking of the age of exploration, the Victorian era of exploration. And one of the heroes of this period, although it wasn't exactly Victorian, it was a decade after Queen Victoria's death, but one of the great heroes of the later age of exploration, still celebrated today by the British, is Robert Falcon Scott, the Antarctic explorer, who sought to find the South Pole and to be the first man to stand on the South Pole and to plant the Union Jack there. Scott set out a little bit before the First World War to find the South Pole. And so he crossed hundreds, more than 1,000 miles of frozen waste with several companions and their sled dogs, going through the snow, over glaciers, around mountains, in pursuit of the South Pole to do what no one else had ever done before. Scott arrived with his men at the South Pole only to discover that a matter of mere weeks, if not days before, the Norwegian explorer Amundsen had got there before him. And so he discovered the Norwegian flag there. Can imagine the heartbreak. Had nothing to do but turn back. And he and his men didn't make it. They died within, I think, a few, after surviving hundreds and hundreds of miles of this grim return journey, walking through blizzards and bone-cracking cold, they got within spitting distance of the coast when they finally gave in and died of exposure and malnutrition and cold, and their bodies were discovered shortly thereafter. At that spot in Antarctica, I haven't been there, but I'm told there is the Scott Memorial, which is a simple wooden cross, 8 or 9 feet tall. And on it is inscribed the last line of this poem: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. It's a compliment. It's perhaps a strange compliment to pay to a man who died, who failed in his objective of being the first to the pole, and who died almost within sight of the coast where his men would have been able to find him and take care of him. And yet, of course, it's not just a silly compliment. It's a comment not on the success, not on the outcome and the success of the mission, but on the spirit that willed a man like Scott and his companions to undertake it. And so we're left with a poem that rings out with this overwhelming appeal to go, to do, to not give in, that the highest part of ourselves is that part of ourselves that would say yes to this kind of adventure and to this kind of seeking, to that Promethean urge. And I can't read this poem and not find myself under its spell. And yet, it is important to take a look at what Dante had to say, because Dante is at least as big an influence on Tennyson in this poem as Homer is. So, late in the Inferno, in the 26th canto of Inferno, Dante and Virgil are in the 8th circle of hell. There are, I think, 10 different regions of the 8th circle where various sinners are being punished for various infractions, the infraction that defined their lives, the sin that defined them. And they come to the circle of the false counselors. Now, we've already met one of these folks when we talked about Prufrock, because Guido de Montefeltro is quoted as the epigraph to Prufrock. So you've heard me talk about not just Dante, but of this section of Dante's masterpiece before. But I thought it was worth bringing it in here because this is the passage more than any other that inspired Tennyson. Dante comes with Virgil to this place, and he sees sinners being punished by being trapped within tongues of flame. And again, the idea that I probably mentioned when we did Prufrock, the idea is that this is appropriate punishment because they misused the tongue in their earthly life as false counselors, breaking the 8th or 9th commandment. And so now they're being punished by being trapped in a tongue of flame. He sees a twin flame burning. In other words, two souls that are sort of burning together. And there are two horns of flame, as he puts it, or tongues of flame. The idea of the tongue of flame is a parody of the Pentecost story from the book of Acts, that having misused the tongue, in the book of Acts, tongues of fire come on the apostles' heads, which represents the baptism of the Holy Spirit, but they don't burn. It's that divine fire that does not burn, but here they are being forever burned by these tongues of flames because they misused their tongues. So Dante and Virgil see a double flame, and the greater horn of flame is Ulysses, and the lesser is Diomedes, who is a figure similar to Ulysses in Homer, but sort of the junior version. And Diomedes and Ulysses had teamed up on various exploits, but they're both being punished for deceit, for false counsel, for episodes such as the Trojan horse episode, where they had fooled and lied to the Trojans in order to bring about their destruction. Dante is an Italian, so he's not a fan of the Greeks. He's a fan of the Trojans. So Ulysses is getting a nasty punishment here. And so Ulysses agrees to speak and to tell them his story, why he is in this place. And he does so in terms that are familiar to us from Tennyson, but they are more unsparing of his character, because Tennyson sort of gives us this portrait of heroism that is unquestionably moving. And if he does tickle our consciences with the idea that all might not be quite right, he does so very lightly. For Dante, Ulysses is not exactly being punished for setting out on that last voyage, but the reason he sets out on that last voyage has to do with, I think, the sort of dishonesty and manipulation that had gotten him in hell for false counsel, for repeated incidents of false counsel. And so if we saw Tennyson giving us a Ulysses who was saying things about his wife and his son and his people that seemed slighting, it's more direct in Dante. And so he says, no tenderness, no duty for his father Laertes, no love for Penelope could overcome my long desire, burning to understand how this world works and to know of human vices, worth, and valor. So Dante's Ulysses wants to know, but his longing to know has shades of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil from the book of Genesis. that he has an almost sort of prurient desire to know. He says not only how the world works, and for a medieval, that's maybe not your business, the way moderns think it is their business and their destiny to know how the world works. For a medieval like Dante, it might not be your business to know how the world works, and also to know of human vices along with worth and valor is telling. And so we have a comparable exhortation to the one in Tennyson to set out to see. Only here, the suggestion is stronger, that Ulysses manipulates men to their deaths for his own Promethean urges. And those Promethean urges are not licit in Dante the way they might have been for a writer like Tennyson. Tennyson doesn't, I think, celebrate that Prometheanism the way Shelley does. But he doesn't condemn it either. In Dante, the mark of condemnation is clear. And so he puts out with all his friends, the little crew that had not abandoned me, Dante's Ulysses says, and he describes his voyage through the Western Mediterranean. As the Mediterranean Sea is narrowing, as the European coast and the African coast almost come together and touch at the Straits of Hercules, he says, with Seville on his right to the north in Spain and Ceuta on the northern Moroccan coast on his left, he passes through the Straits of Hercules. And he says, the Straits of Hercules, what we also know as the Straits of Gibraltar, were supposedly marked out by Hercules or Heracles, depending on if you're Greek or Latin, marked out by Hercules as what was known as the ne plus ultra, the no more beyond, the ne plus ultra, the boundary, the limit that human beings are not supposed to go beyond. The Straits of Hercules were supposed to represent the end of the world of human beings. And to go beyond them is not exactly a sin as such, because the ancient Greeks don't really think in terms of sin. But human beings don't belong there and can't expect anything there. And so to violate the ne plus ultra is something that, Sputnik and the Apollo missions and the Manhattan Project, all of these things that human beings in the modern world do to go further, that sometimes for us have uncomfortable associations, right? Are going beyond the ne plus ultra, violating it and going forward. And we tend to see that as heroic, even as we worry about the implications, say, of artificial intelligence or something like that. And so for Dante, Ulysses' determination to go further is more of an outright violation. And so on they go. They've reached the Occident, the West, but there's more ocean ahead of them, so they're going to keep going. And they turn, he says, to the left, which means to go south. The medievals, first of all, always good to have the reminder that people in the Middle Ages didn't actually believe the earth was flat. Tennyson may assume that Ulysses thought it was, but educated people in the Middle Ages knew, as people had known for hundreds of years, that the earth was spherical. Astronomy told them that. And so Dante understands the world is round, is spherical. But medievals tend to assume that one could never get to the southern hemisphere, or it was just implausible and pointless. Perhaps the torrid zone around the center of the equator is too hot and we couldn't survive passage through it. But anyway, what is there to find? Well, there might be something there, and Ulysses is going to find it. And so on he goes, and he discovers the great continent that Dante imagines in the Southern Ocean, which is surmounted by Mount Purgatory. Purgatory, for Dante, is a place in the southern hemisphere of this globe where souls go when they die for purification. All the souls in Dante's Purgatory, and this squares with medieval Catholic theology, all of those souls are saved. But they nonetheless, depending on the life lived, have to be purified before they are able to enter paradise. But if they come to the continent of purgatory, they are saved. And it's just a matter of time and of what they have to undergo as they ascend the mountain so that they can experience the presence of God in the beatific vision. Ulysses and his men travel, he says, for 5 months. And this is heroic. He offers Tennysonian language, or Tennyson, I guess, offers Dantean language, but he says, "You were not made to live as mindless brutes, but go in search of virtue and true knowledge." However, Dante questions whether that quest is really virtuous. And he says, "I made them so keen to keep going that I could hardly have restrained them." He whetted their appetites, almost as though getting them drunk with his own words. So they get into the southern hemisphere, the stars are strange, and after 5 months of journeying, they are delighted to see this mountain rising out of the ocean. And yet, as soon as they see it and begin to rejoice, a wind comes off the land, and it shakes and rocks the ship 3 times with great waves, and eventually on the 4th, the ship broaches and is whelmed and goes to the bottom until once more the sea closed over us, Ulysses says. And so that, since you ask, Dante, is how I came to be down here in the 8th circle of hell. He says this wind came and we went down as pleased another's will. So Ulysses for Dante represents, as far as the human being can go, towards transcendence, towards the ultimate. But he can't ever get there. The only way for Dante that you can get to purgatory, which means eventually to get to paradise, is through God. It has to be through God's grace and through, Dante would believe, the church. Ulysses and his men get close enough to see in the distance the mountain, and they are destroyed even as they have that sight. So they never get there. They can't get there. It pleased another's will that we go down to the bottom. Tennyson doesn't offer an outright condemnation of Ulysses in his poem. And I think going further, he offers us a picture of Promethean heroism that is unquestionably attractive, because it is so attractive. Even Dante recognizes its attraction as Ulysses speaks to these men and convinces them. Tennyson rather gives us this portrait of heroism, but also, I think, shows us how it's inherent in this particular kind of man and not necessarily a blessing. It's hard not to admire the Robert Falcon Scotts of the world who are willing to undertake such danger and such hardship in quest of a record, of being able to say, I have done it. And yet, of course, such men often, or sometimes at least, wind up frozen on the Ross ice shelf, dying without success. We can't help but honor them, although we also maybe are given to wonder if sitting by the still hearth on the barren crag is the worst thing that could happen to us. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed spending a little time with Tennyson and with Ulysses. I think that will do it for us now. And I will just say thank you for joining us. On behalf of Eric Williams, this is David Anderson, and you've been listening to Professing Literature. Be well.